So this lecture is about the Malay, a Thai minority. So Malay-speaking peoples, let's think a little bit about them generally. We did talk in the first lecture of this unit of the course that there is this country of Malaysia. And in fact, Malays are a Southeast Asian ethnic group, Austronesian speakers, who are really scattered throughout Southeast Asia. You can find Malays in Malaysia, but also in Singapore, in Brunei, in Western Indonesia, and as we're learning about, in southern Thailand. And Austronesian is a distinct language family, and it's unique from any of the other language groups of Asia that we've talked about. Malay people see themselves as connected with the indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia. In fact, they believe that that Malay are one of the indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia. So in Malaysia, where there are both what we would call indigenous peoples as well as Malay, they have a concept of the Bumi Putra, which would include the Malay and indigenous peoples in one local indigenous category. And part of the reasons for this is that Malay culture has been influenced by many indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia. It has syncretized with many of the practices in terms of things like food and art and music and so on with the other peoples of Southeast Asia. Because of that, you find a lot of local variation among Malay people, depending if they're in Singapore, in Brunei, or in areas of Indonesia, or areas, different islands, right, of Malaysia. We need to remember that Southeast Asia, once you've left the Asian mainland, you get into what is called the Indonesian archipelago, thousands of different islands. And so some Malay peoples have developed unique, right, cultural practices that are dependent on their local community rather than all Malay communities. And so there are certain features about the Malay that really unite them together. So it may not be a particular food or a particular music or particular art form that is found all throughout Malay communities, but there are certain features that are kind of celebrated as markers, cultural attributes, right, that really do hold them together as an ethnic group. There are many different dialects of Malay. There's variety there, but at their structural basis or foundation, it is the same language, and that is an important marker for Malay ethnic identity. One example of one of these local communities of Malay would be considered the Patani Malay of southern Thailand. So they are one kind of Malay, one group of Malay in the Malay broader world. We can talk about other subgroups, the Taragananan Malay, across the border in Malaysia, the Bruneian Malay, and so on. So the Patani Malay are the Malay of southern Thailand, and they speak their own distinct dialect, Patani Malay. Although now Patani Malay, they're in southern Thailand, are facing a number of different kinds of social problems. You have racial and ethnic discrimination by Thai, you have problems of poverty, unemployment, crime, and a number of different sort of failed development and conservation attempts by the state in this region. So you can think about language really holding Malay together as an ethnic group. You can think about the local communities that really have formed strong local Malay identities. And the other feature I think that is really important that we can talk about that's beyond any one Malay community that we see across Malay communities is the religion of Islam. That is, Malay are Muslim people. And this is something that's not new for Malay. They began conversion in the 1400s. So you have 6 different centuries, right, of Islamic history in this region. And it's an important part of the Malay ethnic community. Now, Malay Islam is distinct. Its own practices are unique. And we're going to kind of bracket that out because I think we could have a whole course, right, on just what Islam is and how Malay Islam is distinct. You do have the government of Thailand, as well as governments of countries like Malaysia, that have advocated a moderate form of Islam. That is, they've gotten involved in religious practice. More conservative and political forms of Islam are becoming more popular. That is, they are moving throughout the world and they are affecting Muslim communities. Muslim communities are thinking about these forms, they are debating these forms, they are criticizing these forms, and so on. For Malay, a religious education has always been an important part of becoming Malay. And this is closely tied with the Islamic tradition. So education is not just important for Malay, but it's important for Muslims generally. The learning of Arabic as a second language for religious purposes, the ability to read the Quran in Arabic, in the primary language of the Quran. The traditional religious institutions, the equivalent of what is called in other parts of the Islamic world, the madrasas, the Islamic schools, right? These have been central in importing this kind of Islamic wisdom and Islamic knowledge, right, to Malay people. But with development, with change in Thailand, Thailand has emphasized secular education, and they have not closed Islamic schools, but their regulations, right, and their certification for schools have forced Islamic schools to change and to include more secular components. And this has been seen as a threat to Islamic identity. It's been a threat to Malay identity. The idea among the Islamic educators is that while the school may now serve more of what the Thai government seeks, in fact, the schools are not able to produce as good of Islamic teachers as they had in the past. They aren't able to teach, right, the kind of Islam that they were taught in the past. So to conclude, what have we been doing, right, in this particular lecture? We are moving beyond just thinking about Thai diversity to honing on specifically the Malay minority, that is the minority Malay ethnic group in Thailand. And we talked about that the Malay in Thailand are an important sub-ethnic group. They are the Patani Malay, and they have some cultural practices which are distinct from other parts of the Malay world, including a distinct dialect, Patani Malay. And then finally, we said if you want to begin to understand Thailand's Malay minority, a very important feature, right, of their culture is their worldview, their religious worldview. The Malay are Muslims, and Islam, the religion of Muslims, is very important to them.